I want to introduce Robert Moore, who I think is something of a pioneer. He's been a leading figure in bringing the study and content of anthropology to bear in the exploration between psychotherapy and religion. His recent endeavors have been in the areas, interestingly enough, of sacred space and transformation and ritual process in psychotherapy. Dr. Moore received his PhD in psychology and religion from the University of Chicago and is now professor of psychology and religion at Chicago Theological Seminary. As one might guess from this small sampling from his curriculum vitae, Robert Moore is a searcher of psyche and soul. He is a diplomate Adlerian analyst and presently a diploma candidate in the analyst training program of the C.G. Jung Institute. All to say that he's willing to follow all roads which hold some promise of understanding. It appears that several roads have converged for Bob in the work of C.G. Jung, and we are the beneficiaries of that convergence in what he'll say to us this morning and what he'll say to us in the future as his pilgrimage progresses. He is presently hard at work co-authoring a book on Jungian analysis and Whitehead's metaphysics and co-editing a book on Jung's contemporary spirituality. You should also know that Bob was a prominent member of the collective father I mentioned on Thursday night and has been an important part in shaping the content and the flow and the structure of this conference. He has been a member of the board of directors of the C.G. Jung Center and is currently a member of the Institute's advisory board and faculty. Dr. Moore's books include John Wesleyan Authority, A Psychological Perspective, The Cult Experience, Responding to the New Religious Pluralism, co-authored with J.G. Melton, and Anthropology and the Study of Religion, of which he's a contributing co-editor with Frank Reynolds. I've known Bob Moore for nearly 5 years now and have an ever-increasing respect for his scholarship, his intensity of perception, and his ability to master diverse fields and interrelate them in ways that illuminate and inspire. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Robert Moore.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be asked to be able to be your final speaker today. In many ways, given the content of the lectures that have gone before in the workshops, a person with my perspectives and commitments could very well say just amen and sit down. But you paid, thank you, George. I always bring George Fichette to work on my grandiosity. But you paid your money and you have to put up with it now. So here we go. Seriously, if you discern a little method in the madness of this conference, it's because there was some collaboration and conversation among various of us along the way, and I know that you see these from your experience in the workshops and from your hearing of the content of these many presentations. You see the many common themes, and by this time many of you could give this lecture probably better than I. But here, let's go fast. A number of you have suffered through this content with me in workshops or courses, which included 10 to 15 hours of work. And we're going to go once over, I fear, very lightly this morning, but with the preceding work that's been done, I think you all will be able to follow along very, very well. When this is published, it will probably be entitled The Archetype of Initiation and Contemporary Religion, The Legacies of Mircea Eliade, Victor Turner, and Carl Jung. Let me begin with a few personal words about a friend of mine who died recently, and that is Vic Turner. His recent untimely death is a tragic loss, not just to his field of cultural anthropology, but to all of us Jungians and people who seek to relate religion and culture in both theoretical and practical ways. There's scarcely a single humanistic or social scientific discipline which was untouched by the power of his mind and the breadth of his concerns. At the time of his death in December of 1983, he was continuing to broaden and deepen his processual symbolic analysis in both its scope and applications to the pluralistic global challenges which face us on this troubled planet. I had had the privilege for several years of being his collaborator in attempts to rethink the role of ritual in human adaptation, especially for a postmodern planetary culture. This collaboration went on under the auspices of the Institute for Religion in an Age of Science and culminated in a conference held in Chicago, which many of you attended, on the topic of ritual and human adaptation. And one of the things that I want to call your attention to is those conference proceedings which were published in the September 1983 issue of Zygon. It was in the major address to that conference that Victor Turner, in a very short time prior to his death, came out publicly as a Jungian in his understanding of the relationship between brain, body, and ritual. At the time of his death, we were in the process of planning another conference which would follow up and illuminate the relationship between the archetypes, neurophysiology, and human transformation. And his death torpedoed much of the work for that conference, although some of the work was carried on under a Star Island conference theme, and those proceedings, though not as powerful as they would have been had Vic lived, are available in a subsequent issue of Zygon. You may want to look that up. But we are confronted with the task of continuing to develop the implications of his thought for both Freudian and Jungian psychoanalysis and for religious leadership in this postmodern planetary era. In a way that echoes what you have heard from Bill Doles. In a recent article in Ministry magazine, I reflected on the strange way in which theological education and most of our religious communities in the mainline churches and synagogues have lost the sense for ministry as uniquely religious leadership. I noted the way in which most seminaries now, as Bill has lifted up to you, do not tend to draw on cultural anthropology and the history of religions for insights into what makes ministry unique among its cognate professions. I discussed the tendency to de-emphasize symbolic forms, myth, ritual, and the resulting growing hegemony of secularized models of ministry issuing either from the culture of professionalism or from Marxist pietism. Cut off from an understanding of the nature of homo religiosus and the nature of religious leadership, ministry and theological education in our country and around the world have suffered increasingly from an identity crisis of serious proportions. In the present discussion, I want to narrow my focus to one significant issue through which we can see the importance of these resources from the history of religions and from cultural anthropology for both those of us involved in the practice of analysis and in leadership in the religious community. That of the nature and significance of sacred space in religious life and community. The name of Mircea Eliade, of course, immediately comes to the reader's mind in this context. Let me just say that I'm going to be very brief in these comments on the background of the discussion on sacred space. If you want to find a more technical description, you will find it in the chapter entitled Space and Transformation in Human Experience in the Anthropology and Religion book. But Eliade's entire corpus of writings on the human religious experience is based on the central role played by his distinction between the sacred and the profane in the religious experience of archaic Homo religiosus. For Eliade, the key experience in archaic religious life was that of the heterogeneity of space and time in religious experience. Now, it is amazing, as influential as Eliade, the greatest living historian and phenomenologist of religion, as important as his work is and as influential as it is, the key critical importance of this distinction between his view of space as being heterogeneous has been lost on so many people. You cannot find studies which highlight the importance of this bifurcation of space and time in human religious and transformation experiences. For Eliade, and you've got it plotted here, and we'll be referring back to this shortly, but for Eliade, profane space and time was characterized by duration, disorientation, and deterioration. That is to say, there was no center there. Sacred space and time, on the other hand, manifested in an encounter with the eternal, the orienting center, and regeneration. Sacred space, in short, was the locus of regeneration, creativity, and transformation. The capacity to locate and utilize appropriately such transformative space was the special province of the religious leader in human culture. Now, it is that distinction on the bifurcation of the different types of space and time in human experience that Eliade's sacred and profane discussions rest. It is the archetypal basis upon which his book on initiation, rites and symbols of initiation, rests. And without seeing that importance of the heterogeneity of space and time, there's no way to see the way in which Eliade's work holds together theoretically and practically. But in Eliade's view, modernization brought with it a fall for human culture, in that it marked a loss of the capacity to experience space and time as heterogeneous. In effect, in Eliade's view, for moderns, all space and time is profane. The experiences of space and time are homogeneous. This meant for Eliade that moderns living under the conditions of contemporary industrial culture and technical rationalism could not have an experience of sacred space. It is easy to see why Eliade concluded that modernization had brought an end to the ability to experience sacred space. The iconoclastic influences of the Reformation were the beginnings of what has proven to be a sustained movement toward the depreciation of the importance of ritual process in religious life. With the impact of the Enlightenment and subsequent trends in secularization, this decline in understanding of and appreciation for the importance of ritual process and ritual leadership has continued. Today, it is difficult to find either religious leaders or psychotherapists who have much of a grasp of either the power of ritual process or the way in which the effectiveness of ministry or therapy depends upon the adequacy of ritual leadership. In contemporary industrial culture, the human need for ritualization in many areas of life has not diminished. What has diminished, however, is the availability of knowledgeable ritual elders who understand the archetypal needs of humans for ritualization throughout the life cycle, and who are prepared to respond competently and responsibly by providing ritual leadership to those in need of it. Failures in ritual leadership in contemporary culture are manifested in many ways. Among the most important of these failures are inadequate provision for initiatory process in transition states, whether life cycle based or precipitates of life crises, rituals of conflict resolution, whether intrapersonal or interpersonal, and probably most important today, bonding rituals to facilitate species identification. It is easy to see the results of inadequate attention to initiatory process. The increasing anomie which we observe among youth and young adults is a distressing case in point. We lack images and models of mature masculinity and femininity, and we seem to believe that maturation into mature adulthood just happens. In my own life and in my practice of analysis, I see day after day the human tragedy which occurs because we have not attended to the seriousness of the crisis in failed initiations which currently afflicts our own lives and our culture. We discuss midlife crises without any real realization of the ritual dimensions involved in such critical junctures in life, and again, credits to Bill Doles for his comments on this. And we usually view coping with such crises as merely personal challenges to the individual involved. In fact, such crises are biosocial in nature and demand by their very nature a response which can only be seen as social ritualization. When adequate ritual leadership is absent, as is usually the case in our culture, the individual unconsciously seeks out partners in ritualization wherever they may be found. In terms of conflict resolution, the dimensions of our crisis in ritual leadership are enormous. In tribal cultures, ritual processes existed to deal with the potent emotional residues of intrapersonal, interpersonal, and intertribal conflicts. That which Jungian psychoanalysts call the shadow side of both individual and group life was honestly faced and processed through ritual means. While in pre-modern culture, and I want to dissociate myself from those that are romantic about pre-modern cultures here. While in pre-modern culture, these ritual techniques were often brutal and involved the liberal use of scapegoating and other mechanisms based in intrapsychic splitting phenomena, they did nevertheless honestly address the seriousness and depth of the emotional problems issuing from the cauldron of human social existence. Ritual techniques in tribal cultures were effective in maintaining and enhancing group identification and mediating conflict, while reducing the residual toxic effects of what psychoanalysts call narcissistic rage, the narcissistic rage elicited by such conflict. In our cultural context, the challenge is much greater and the ritual responses far less adequate. Cultural and religious pluralism in a planetary context complicate the structure and dynamics of conflict and call for a sophistication in ritualization which has not been forthcoming. Perhaps the most dangerous and least understood crisis in ritualization in our contemporary situation lies in the psychocultural dynamics underlying the arms race and the nuclear posturing of the superpowers. In particular, Russia and the United States are currently in the grasp of an archetypically grounded, unconscious ritual dance organized around apocalyptic initiatory imagery and fueled by malignant, untransmuted, repressed emotionality. No national leader, whether political or religious, has demonstrated any understanding of the ritual dimensions of the conflict, much less leadership in responding to the depth dimensions involved. And if that doesn't scare you to death, nothing will. Finally, we must face the reality is that the revolutions in technology have thrust upon us in collapsing social distance on the planet. The need for species identification and species bonding has never been so critical. I am reminded of Murray's beginning words on tribalism in this conference. Murray and I think, are both responding to Erik Erikson's discussion of pseudo-speciation as the primary problem facing human beings on this planet. And one of the things that we have been addressing, and you've heard speaker after speaker address in this conference and in the lectures and in the workshops, the problem of the way in which religious life and religious leaders have been so often part of the problem rather than part of the solution on this. A case in point is the demonic way in which the concept of the people of God has been used by both Jews and Christians. That is, to facilitate and underline and strengthen pseudo-speciation rather than species bonding. Those of us who have studied bonding dynamics in human culture and personality are clear that bonding and identification are complex ritual processes and that they simply do not occur without adequate ritualization. We are therefore faced with a situation in which the need for ritual leadership is greater than it ever has been before. Yet the culture of Protestantism and the subsequent modernization process has rendered us, for all practical purposes, ritually tone deaf. We try to live as if, as Eliade supposed, moderns cannot locate and utilize transformative space. Jungian psychoanalysts often speak of the so-called heroic ego, which is characteristic of the modern consciousness. This is a psychological way of talking about the view of consciousness and perception characteristic of the Enlightenment and modern culture. The perception of the Enlightenment ego is considered to be immaculate perception. Sorry about that. Untainted by shadow dynamics, and not requiring inquiry into the possible falsification of perception by the influence of deep structures unavailable to consciousness. For this Enlightenment consciousness, for this heroic ego, time is homogeneous. And this is acceptable because there is little sense of a need for the relativization of the ego, for its dissolution and reconstitution, its death and rebirth, if you will. Those of you who sat in on David Dalrymple's workshop have seen the images of this process. But the modern consciousness would not be interested in those images. Since a fundamental transformation of consciousness is not believed to be needed, there is no need for a grasp of the heterogeneity of space in human transformation, both personal and social. Now, it is ironic, I think, that this same Enlightenment consciousness gave birth to two interpretive traditions which have turned a revolutionary hermeneutics of suspicion on their predecessor: critical sociology and psychoanalysis. Both have exposed and criticized the fantasy of immaculate perception and the atomistic, isolated individual ego. It has been depth psychology, however, which has begun in recent years to recapture an awareness of the importance of ritualization in modern life. Dynamic psychotherapy, I would argue, has gained much of its influence in contemporary life precisely because of its attention to depth ritual dimensions which many religious communities and religious leaders no longer feel the need to address. I will address this further below in commenting on the significance of the rise of pastoral counseling and psychotherapy within the ministries of the modern church. But here I want to emphasize that the uncritical attitudes with regard to Enlightenment theories of change are presently being challenged at their foundation in the naive theory of consciousness so characteristic of the modern mind, and I might emphasize the modern liberal mind. It is precisely here in our understanding of how change in human culture and personality occurs that we can see the critical importance of the eclipse of the understanding of sacred transformative space, of the necessity of the heterogeneity of space in human transformation in our contemporary cultural and religious crisis. The culture of Protestantism and subsequent modernization gave rise to a dangerous naivete with regard to the nature and dynamics of human consciousness. While the emphasis on the isolated individual psyche and the values of autonomy have had their positive impact in the humanization process, that is, I often tell people that say, well, would you rather live in the Enlightenment era or in the pre-modern, pre-Enlightenment era? And I say, anybody that knows anything about pre-modern era wouldn't choose to live there. It's one thing to think about, being out there, in the wilderness and everything, but where are my flush toilets? My idea of roughing it's anything less than a Holiday Inn. But anyway, the heroic ego of modernity has proven to have a fatal flaw, a flaw grounded in its fantasy of mastery, control, unfalsified perception, and moral superiority. In theological terms, modern culture and consciousness has forgotten the truth embodied in traditional concepts of sin as bondage of the will and depravity of the mind. Given this view of an ego which is free of its biosocial matrix and which once formed is in no need of metamorphosis, and therefore no need of ritual means of transformation, all change is believed to occur primarily through education and realpolitik. That was the progressive fantasy in progressive social movements and in the social gospel movements. World Wars I and II struck a blow at the naive acceptance of the validity of the consciousness of modernity. The inability of the modern mind to grasp the depth dimensions of the Holocaust, however, manifests the tenacity of the appeal of Enlightenment consciousness. For the dragons which lurk beneath the repression barrier of modern consciousness are the same realities which archaic Homo religiosus confronted honestly and dealt with by way of ritual technologies. In his challenge, and here is where Victor Turner takes us beyond Eliade. The legacy of Victor Turner is important because of his challenge to Eliade's assumption that contemporary moderns cannot experience the heterogeneity of space, that moderns cannot experience fundamental psychological and spiritual transformations. For Victor Turner, all human cultures, pre-industrial and contemporary, manifest a metabolic process which includes experiences of the heterogeneity of space. It was his view that new ways could be found to facilitate experiences of liminality and communitas, which were appropriate to and adequate for the challenges of a postmodern planetary culture. He was working along on the development of these ideas at the time of his death. By helping us to look again at this biocultural and biosocial matrix of consciousness and at ritual processes, he's helped us to realize some of the reasons why that optimistic vision of the progressive era in social thought and social transformation circles has gone unrealized. The stark realities of the Holocaust and the threat of nuclear war become much more comprehensible and yet much more terrifying because of the humiliation of the heroic modern ego, which results when we begin to see clearly the way in which the human consciousness is always embedded in biocultural processes. The almost complete ineffectiveness of modern theories of change based in education, persuasion, and political enlightenment becomes increasingly understandable as we realize the fundamental necessity for ritual leadership, which can locate, consecrate, steward, and utilize transformative space in the task of changing both personality and cultural systems. Now, before turning to an elaboration of some of the contributions of Turner's thought, let me take some time here to explicate a little more Turner's understanding. Let me recommend that those of you who've not read any of Turner's work start with his book, The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure. It's a University of Chicago Press paperback. First and foremost, we must understand that in both human personality and culture, there operate inevitably ongoing processes of structurization and destructurization. You've heard this time and time again during this conference, so bear with me. Of both construction and deconstruction. These processes, according to Turner, operate through root metaphors and symbolic paradigms which are not arbitrarily fabricated, but which are grounded in the neural physiology of the human organism, while being elaborated in symbolic forms differently in different cultures. Creativity and innovation are built into the very foundations of this psychocultural metabolic process. There is always a dialectic between structure and communitas, between structure and liminality in both personality and society. As in the thought of Eliade, the fabric of human space-time is not homogeneous, but is characterized in all cultures by heterogeneity. He distinguished between the social functions of ceremonial and what he called deep transformative ritual. Ceremonial, he said, in human culture serves to confirm, consolidate, and legitimate the organization, values, and behaviors of existing structure. The status quo, in other words. We might say that ceremonial celebrates the status quo. Ritual, on the other hand, involves a process of deconstruction and reconstruction in a ritually constructed, as he put it, space-time pod. Or, as the British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott would put it, a holding environment. Let me just comment here. You have heard from the beginning of this conference about a certain kind of religion which is not transformative. And you heard it addressed variously. That relates to Turner's conception of ceremonial and what we can call persona religion. Persona religion. And I might point out that Christians have no corner on persona religion. It is this capacity to live out of persona religion is equally distributed across the face of the planet in different traditions. It is here in his understanding of the importance of transitional space in all human cultures that Turner has given us his greatest gift. He knows that space-time pods can and do exist in contemporary culture. The ritual construction of such sacred space and its appropriate use is not a mere vestige of archaic religious forms, unrelated to and unimportant to more real secular psychosocial processes. Rather, all transitional transformative space is integral to all human, personal, and social process and transformation. Turner has given us for the first time an elaborate phenomenology of the radically different human experience of space within the transformative container in modern contemporary culture. His elaboration of these concepts of structure, communitas, liminal, and liminoid, which we want to talk about in our discussion together, have given us conceptual tools through which we can discern the subtleties of the dynamics of the ways in which deep structural changes occur in human personal, social, and cultural process. Before proceeding further, it's important that we elaborate on the importance of the containment issue during processes of deep change in human personality and society. The word containment is not Turner's, but one which I use to describe the significance of liminal space, Turner's space-time pod. In my view, there is no more important issue which confronts those of us concerned with human transformation, whether psychoanalytic or in religious leadership and community. It is evident to me that apparent personal and social changes which occur outside a context of containment are usually, and I'll put that caveat in there, are usually, if not always, superficial in nature or abortive in consequences. In our discussion, we need to talk about boundary and space, because that's one of the things which neither Turner nor Eliade lifted up adequately, the importance of boundaries. And it's been left to psychoanalysts like Winnicott and Robert Langs to rediscover Jung's own understanding of the transference as a vessel, to bring this emphasis back into the forefront of discussion, the relationship between boundary and transformative space. Deep structural change requires a reliable psychosocial framing, the facilitation of a holding environment which can help individuals and groups tolerate the terrors of change with its attendant facing of painful truths and emotions. In psychoanalytic terms, we would say that the repressed can certainly return outside of a holding environment, but consequently will often issue in destructive unconscious acting out or irreversible fragmentation of the personality. In personality change, for example, the destructuring which occurs in truly liminal states is not fragmentation, but rather a dissolution of inner organizations which had maintained pathological splitting in the early structurization of the personality. In the psychoanalytic holding environment, the pathology-maintaining structures are dissolved without the fragmentation of the self, making possible an integrating, healing movement in the personality toward wholeness and toward a consolidated self-structure. We should be clear here that parallel processes occur or need to occur at all levels of systems in our psychosocial life world. We analysts did not need Turner to teach us about the existence of transformative space. Rather, we needed his conceptual framework to help us see that psychoanalysts are functioning in our culture as ritual elders for a painfully small part of the population. More important, we needed to realize that the dynamics which analysts observe in the consulting room are, or need to be, happening in many other settings at a macro-systemic level. Turner's concepts have, in other words, assisted us in locating psychoanalytic theory, both Freudian and Jungian, in a more comprehensive theory of cultural and personality processes. Now let us turn to an examination, briefly, of the significance of this emphasis on ritual process, that is, the embodiment of the archetype of initiation in contemporary ministry and religious leadership. Now, as Bill Doles and many others have pointed out in this conference, it's difficult today to find rabbis or clergy, theological educators, or seminarians who have any sense whatsoever of the depth dimensions of ministry as ritual leadership. Now, we need to be very clear today, and I've been concerned about this throughout the conference. We need to be clear that many are doing fairly effective ritual leadership out there and don't have the kinds of languages that they need to deepen some of their understandings, but do this intuitively. I mean, for us to posture and to suggest that a great deal of ritual leadership that is truly transformative is not occurring in religious communities of various kinds throughout the world without the help of any Jungian psychoanalyst is incredible inflation. We need to remember that Jungians don't own archetypes, that archetypes are instinctual, and they are human, and they are the property of the human race. And people are going to be affected by and move through the archetype of initiation if the Jungian movement completely comes to an end. We need to get clear about that. We do have a stewardship role, however, in terms of our stewardship of the resources for understanding and facilitating these processes and helping others to be more effective in responding sensitively to these archetypal structures. But anyway, so this is not to say that many don't do fairly effective ritual leadership, but like many therapists, they are so uninformed as to the nature and dynamics of ritual process, transformative space, and so on, that they would be insulted or at least confused if told that they were performing an important role as ritual elders. In fact, I've told some people that and had them look at me with a really strange look. They didn't know whether they'd been insulted or complimented. Boy, you're really a ritual elder. Oh, yeah? You know? The decline of ritual, as Turner uses the term, is at least as complete in American churches and synagogues as anywhere else in our contemporary culture. One could hardly call what passes for worship in most synagogues and churches transformative space-time in a Turnerian sense. Liturgy and much worship more closely resembles what Turner called ceremonial. And there are many ways in which this assertion could be argued convincingly. Here, however, I will limit myself to pointing out one telling factor, which is a litmus test, which illustrates the point. If transformative space is indeed constituted in any given setting, that which has been the source of conflict in a person or group is invited to appear in the context of containment. Now think about this. In effect, the repressed is invited to return right there. This is, of course, the intentionality behind, for example, the Christian understanding of the confessional. But the decline of the confessional in Christian worship should be understood in this context. Can you imagine what would happen in a church if they really invited the repressed to return in the context of worship? The shadow to manifest, and people to be honest in the context of worship. See? The honesty is a characteristic of transformative space. And I would suggest that in most religious so-called worship today, that is not something that is at a high priority. In Jungian psychoanalytic terms, we would say that Christian worship and other kinds of worship, so often, anytime you see this angelistic spirituality that passes for Christian spirituality around, that Christian worship has become persona restoring and not a place for the personal or congregational shadow to return, to be confronted or to be wrestled with in an intense and committed way. In this context, it's extremely ironic that the pastoral counseling movement within the Christian community has been disparaged as being a secular deviant, too individualistic, not really an integral part of the life of the church. As I noted above, much of our current awareness about the depth dimensions of ritualization in personality and culture we owe to the Freudian and Jungian psychoanalytic traditions. I've argued that psychotherapists and analysts of various schools are providing ritual leadership in more depth than many overtly religious leaders. And the actual significance of the rise of specialized ministries in pastoral psychotherapy and counseling, and I might add in group leadership and retreat leadership in the wider church, has been to return to the church a capacity to offer healing ritualization through the provision of true sanctuaries, where the personal and group shadow can manifest and be dealt with effectively, and where deep structural transformations can occur. Again, like psychotherapists, pastoral counselors are notorious for not being able to articulate clearly why their ministry is in fact deeply religious in nature and central to the work of the church and ministry. Hopefully now a number of leading pastoral counselors are using Turner's conceptual framework to help them articulate the deep foundations of their ministry which previously they only intuited. Now I had a section in here on the life of the congregation which I can omit thanks to Bill's presentation. I'll just lift up once again what he was saying to us. Recently, there's been an increasing emphasis on the role of the congregation, and some have tried to make the congregational context and counseling ministries enemies. Certain seminaries in this area, which will remain nameless until after the lecture, think that ministries of counseling have nothing to do with congregational life. But if you use this conceptuality that we have here, you can see the dynamic internal relatedness between counseling ministries and the congregation as a system. You heard it in Bill's own presentation. There's been very little progress at the theoretical level in understanding the foundational religious dynamics, ritual dynamics at the heart of congregational life. Should the congregation serve as a holding environment? That was the essence of what Bill was presenting to you. Yes, it already does, and we need to make it work better that way. If we can become more conscious of these ritual dynamics in the congregational context, we will be more effective in facilitating what Charles Winquist has called a communion of possibility within the local church. Now, it's not merely within the congregation, however, that we must consider the challenge of ministry. I've noted above that in pre-industrial culture, ritual techniques were used to resolve conflicts beyond the group, to negotiate intergroup conflict, and to facilitate intergroup reconciliation. Certainly no one can deny that the task of confronting the destructive implications of pseudo-speciation at the national and international level can be ignored. Do we have any examples of ritual leadership and social transformation which we can examine for hints of how ritual leadership might provide alternatives to current trends in leadership in this area? It is instructive, I believe, to think about the ministry of Martin Luther King in this context. King did not reduce his leadership, like so many of his followers, to moral posturing, dehumanizing those he wished to change by massive shadow projections upon them. Neither did he allow his leadership to deteriorate into just one more expression of realpolitik, although there were many people that wanted him to do that. One can examine carefully the dramatic forms of his leadership and his tactics and interpret them as ritual leadership on a national scale. Through the power of his personality and leadership, Jungians would say through the ego-self axis which he had attained, he was able to turn the streets of racist cities into sacred geography, containing powerful emotions, allowing the social shadow to become manifest, and facilitating deep structural changes in the psyches not only of his followers but of those of his opponents. Social structure was transformed in the same ritually created alchemical vessel that elicited these changes in psyche. I am suggesting then that King's role, that of cultural innovator in Erik Erikson's sense, can be understood as having deep roots in ritual process, and scholars are now beginning to examine King's leadership from this interpretive perspective. And many other contemporary social justice ministries need to be examined from this perspective. I think of prison ministries to poverty, and so forth. Because social action based on an Enlightenment theory of consciousness is doomed to failure. Attending to the archetype of initiation as it is manifest in these processes which Turner has described and which Jungians try to understand psychologically, gives us a source for new insights into tactics which can change deep structures in our quest for wholeness in human community. The choice, in closing, the choice is to ignore these ritual processes and the necessity for providing leadership and accessing this transformative space and stewarding it, helping people in and out of it, both individually and in groups. And the choice boils down to having people try to live their lives without containers, or at least without adequate containers. Choice between containerless minds or mindless containers. We've got a choice in our culture. We can act out our vision quest through psychological or social symptoms on a scale ranging from the personal to the planetary, which is what we're doing now for the most part. Or we can together try to return to the ancient archetypal wisdom that we must try both to seek and to offer adequate, and apologies to Nathan, good enough ritual leadership for the human pilgrimage through the valley of the shadow toward the archetypal vision of the blessed planetary community. That is our choice. Jungians, particularly Jungians in religious communities, have a stewardship role in this issue of whether this kind of ritual leadership is going to be provided for this planet and for its children. I'd like to stop there and have us have some discussion now. Now, those of you who have been looking at this chart see here described in a chart the tripartite structure of this transformative process that we've all been talking about this week. And you can see how so much of what has been said in this conference and what has been lifted up and what has been heard can be plotted in this way. You can think both about these theories and you can think about your own life and your own pilgrimage in this way. You can ask where you are in this process to move from left to right, hopefully. Hopefully. Remind me in the course of our discussion to talk a little bit about chronic liminality and what we need to do about that. But let's just open it up for questions of clarification, points you would like to make, ways you would like to try to tie together some of the other things you have encountered and learned in this conference through reflecting on this archetypal structure that underlies so much of this conference. Let's just open it up. Yes?
Dr. Moore, could you explain the difference between pseudo-speciation and species bonding? I'm not
Yes.
clear about that.
Pseudo-speciation is when you use any identification, is when you, this is just for the recorder, is when you use any kind of group identification in order to make you the people. It's like in many pre-modern cultures, the word for the tribe is simply human being in the language. And that's the way we Jews and Christians have tended to use the concept of the people of God. And I'm suggesting that that is really the way that is interpreted and used in the preaching of many otherwise progressive clergy is really facilitating of pseudo-speciation. Now, species bonding is simply making the point that's been made time and time again in this conference. Look, we are one people. We're all animals, folks, and we belong to the same species. And any religion which keeps our mind off that is demonic. Period. Pathological splitting is what it amounts to. Pathological splitting. In fact, psychoanalytically, the issue which we have got to deal with is very simply how we're going to create whole object relationships with other people on this planet. Other comments? Yes.
I appreciate very much your distinction between ceremony and deep transformative ritual. But I'm wondering if a community can actually live at the level of this deep transformation week after week, a high church community that celebrates repeatedly, and if there isn't some middle ground without falling into the status quo, authentication.
We all have the need for persona. For Jungians, persona is not a bad thing. Persona is the equivalent in Jungian terms of Erik Erikson's concept of identity. So if you don't have some ceremonial to celebrate your status quo, you're not going to maintain your group. And if you don't maintain your group, then the responsibilities which the divine reality, say, theologically has assigned to your group to steward are not going to get done. So Turner's not knocking ceremonial. Ceremonial has its place. Structure is not a naughty thing for Turner. Turner doesn't worship liminality. Anybody that has been in a liminal state lately won't either. It's the thing I'm always trying to tell people about sacred space. Say, folks, it's not nice and it doesn't even smell good. And that's one of the things that I thought about this turd in this conference, how wonderfully appropriate it is to talk about that, because in sacred space is where the sewage appears. If it's really sacred, the sewage appears. Think about the dreams you've had and your analysans have had about discovering that sewer down in there.
I wonder if you'd explain just a little more clearly the distinction between that heterogeneous space-time and the homogeneous. I didn't
All right.
quite get it.
Now let's think a little bit about this discussion which we talked about the dominance of masculinity and so forth in so many religious structures and the place of the goddess. I want to suggest you think a little bit about this. In so much religion, the leaders are so scared of liminality that they try to take the curtain here and pull it out like this and pull it together and hide this middle phase. Just sew it up right down here. I wish I had a piece of paper to show you how that works. But you just take these and put it together so you don't see this place. We're not going to have any of this liminality in my church. I mean, those charismatics, you know. I mean, you ever talk to a pastor about charismatics in the congregation? They're messing too much with this liminal business, you know. They'd rather have a lot of promiscuous sexual acting out, which is also liminal, than all that speaking in tongues. See? But I'm serious. Think about it. When you get persona religion really going, and you know, masculine traditions have been afraid of chaos. You know, one of the things that differentiates us Jungians from Freudians, not as much as a lot of people think, but we tend to see in liminality a little more promise than Freudians tend to. Differences are not as starkly drawn as they're not really as stark as a lot of people want to draw them, particularly recently, among recent developments in Freudian analysis. They're more Jungian now. But Freudians, like so many people in this patriarchal tradition, see chaos. They look at this and they see most of the chaos. And they say, boy, we got to build that ego structure, and let's drug them. You know, the passing out of all this Valium in this country. You know, the biggest, most dangerous drug in this country is not heroin, it's not marijuana, it's not cocaine, it's Valium. The research shows that the people in enormous numbers of religious orders in this country are Valium junkies. See, and you take a lot of Valium when you want to stay away from too much of this stuff. When your religious order threatens to become a place of the wilderness for you, take a little more Valium. But anyway, so think about this as the place of the goddess. After all, it's the womb of the tomb and the tomb of the womb. Now, feminists always interest me in the way they talk about the goddess. That comes across as so nice and loving. And I keep wanting to tell a lot of them, why don't you study a little more phenomenology and history of religions and get a few more of these archetypal feminine folks out here, because some of them, like some of you named Kali, the feminine counterpart of Shiva, in terms of destructiveness. This is where you need a god or goddess of destruction, right here at this first threshold. Because when something needs to die, you need to invoke a god or a goddess of destruction. There's nothing wrong with Kali, but I fear that Kali remains in the shadow of a lot of feminists, and the men see her, and they don't. But we need to realize nothing wrong with Kali, any more than there's anything wrong with Shiva. When you need a psycho-spiritual DNC, you need Kali or Shiva energies to cleanse out the consciousness so something new, Christ child, can be born there.
I'd like to suggest that this is one of this particular middle space is the space that I look at as the direct or immediate experience of the god or goddess, in which these things, the sewage, the darkness, all that kind of thing comes up and really, really makes a transformation. And it's the kind of thing that some people, I think some people talk about as being the spiritual crisis that happens. Because this particular middle time space is very, very crucial, especially now.
And let's face up to that's. I totally agree with that. And let's face up to the way in which this thing does turn on some archetypal masculine, archetypal feminine issues here. Because it's very difficult for a man relating to his archetypal masculinity to understand inner space. Let's just face it. You know, anything that's important happens on the outside, folks. Anything that's important happens on the outside, right? But you know, somehow nobody in this audience believes that, right? So think about that in terms of the importance of the goddess and why there is such a response when the goddess is invoked. But if you understand this archetypal structure, we're all wired for understanding and relating to and being transformed in the belly of the goddess. We're all wired for it, neurophysiologically. It's just sometimes it's hard for us women and men to find her. And when you get somebody that has undergone some kind of crisis, either life cycle related or catastrophic in nature, you get kicked into an understanding, an intuitive understanding of the need for this threshold. You start looking for the boundary. You start searching for a container. You start looking for the belly of the goddess. But she is hard to find, folks. That's why so many people get into substance abuse. They're looking for her stomach. That's why so many people go to the wilderness, literally go to the wilderness, to the desert, to the mountains. They are trying to find that boundary that can hold all of this stuff, this crazy, chaotic stuff that is wanting to be dealt with and born in them. And then I said we should talk about boundary and space. The difference between liminal and liminoid is really important, and you should work on Turner's corpus to get a sense for this. And let me just summarize it. Liminoid is when you know you need some transformation and regeneration, and you start looking for it, and you just go out on the boundary rather than inside a boundary. That is to say, and I purposefully made this a dotted line here. Chronic liminality results when you mistake liminoid experiences for liminal transformation. Leaky boundaries always make for liminoid experiencing. You analysts always think about that clinically when you're talking about frame issues, breaking the frame, because we intuit and our analyzans intuit that when the boundary is permeable, you can't get the temperature hot enough to cook. The pressure cooker has got to get hot enough or you're going to have a psycho-spiritual abortion. And a lot of what passes for transformative religious experience is not liminal. It's liminoid. And although people, I always retain the possibility that some of us are saints and go out there in that desert in that vision quest, and we get out there and you know the archetype of initiation is constellated and the self is there and we're just transformed and all that sort of thing right out there by ourselves. For every time that occurs, it is my personal guess that you have a liminoid experience, tremendously intense, wonderfully gratifying in some ways, and which you're going to want to repeat next week or next summer. And this is the kind of thing that happens when people become chronically liminal groupies in encounter groups or Jungian conferences or, or whatever.
What causes the leaky boundaries that you are speaking about in analysis in particular that doesn't allow the pressure cooker to get hot enough?
Well, you know, we used to always blame it on the resistance of the analyzane. Yes. What causes leaky boundaries in analysis? We used to always blame it on the resistances of the analyzane. Now we know that usually a resistant analyzane really means an analyst who hasn't dealt with their own sewage. Because they're in their own analytical work, the boundary may have not been kept tight enough for the heat to get, you know, just because you've had 10 years of analysis doesn't mean it's worked. Just because you have an analytical diploma doesn't mean you were analyzed. And so usually the incapacity, just read Lang, read Goodhart, read so many other people, they're fundamentalists on this issue, you know. You know, they're like the person playing the guitar, you know, and playing E chord all the time. And they wondered why they were always playing E chord. He said, other people looking for it, I found it. Well, that's the way Robert Lang says about this issue of the boundary. But you can't play any good country western song without E chord. At least I can't. So the boundary is important, and a lot of the time, an analyst cannot maintain a boundary because they're acting out in the countertransference. They're acting out their own issues with an analysand. And it's not bad analysts that do this. All analysts do this to some degree. Because we've all got something trying to come conscious in the analytical process. So that's why Jungians like to think that this analyst-analysand relationship is a team work with the self leading and not the inflated analyst leading. Yes.
Well, have you not now just addressed the issue and speaking on behalf of masculine consciousness that unless you raise these things out of chaos, and that the masculine is the one that basically sets the boundaries. It certainly does the culture.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, and that's one of the things that, did you hear that? No. She's raising the question about the role of the masculine in making boundaries. Now, that's an interesting question, and it's one that in my research, I haven't been able to figure out where one comes down on that, because, for example, one person that's been very influential on me is a Freudian D.W. Winnicott, and in his discussion of boundary and space and the holding environments. And his understanding of the model for transformative space is the mother-infant relationship. And you could argue that, adequate containment can be modeled on the feminine as well as on the masculine. And so probably one of the things we all ought to study is the boundary facilitation characteristic of the masculine and boundary facilitation characteristic of the feminine. Maybe they do it differently. In fact, this is one of the things that we argue about in analysis a lot. Well, do you have to do it Lang's way in order to have a boundary? Or can some analysts not create this by virtue of who they are? And we always argue about that. And I suspect that it has something to do with your question, Lois, that there's something more subtle going on here than I can plumb.
I was going to ask that too, because I think that if we look at the difference between the way men relate to the first love relationship, that is the mother, and the way the woman relates to that, one is a relationship of difference and separation. The other is a relationship of similarity and network. And if we look at this issue of boundary and space, I think that the woman and the man are going to experience this differently. And that's where we have to put some effort in looking at and trying to discriminate and differentiate that.
That would also say that we need to realize that the real issue is the archetypal issue of holding.
Containing.
It's
too.
containing. Well, that's equivalent. Yeah, containing. That's the archetypal issue. And that masculine consciousness and personality and feminine consciousness and personality may go about facilitating that in different ways, and we need to work probably more on that and trying to get a sense for that. Other comments? Many of you? Yes, June.
I've always been interested to notice that the analysts who talk about tight boundaries are always male, almost exclusively. And I'm reminded that about a century before Jung, William Blake said, the fountain overflows and the cistern contains, referring to the masculine and the feminine. And I think with the masculine's intrusive way of dealing with issues, that matter of boundaries is very important. I think for the female analyst, it's natural to be a container, and that that's not as large an issue. And possibly that's one of the reasons why today so many people are looking to women analysts to provide that secure space. And possibly the male analyst needs to work through his anima, through that perhaps less developed aspect of himself, which is also present, in order to create that kind of space.
Thank you, June. Could you all hear that? One thing that brings to my mind, we can be honest here. One of the things that brings to my mind is that I have felt a long time, in response to what you're saying, that a lot of the tone of the discussion about holding this frame and keeping those, antiseptic boundaries has a sort of a schizoid feel to it, like, don't touch me, and with the emphasis on emotionally. And so I think that very probably, and if you study the developmental work of Daniel Levinson and of Carol Gilligan, it makes sense to assume that a male analyst would have a little more work to do on managing countertransference issues around the capacity to hold intimately without having the anxiety level go up too much. I think many male analysts do this very well. But in my own experience trying to learn analysis, I have experienced enough terrible anxiety about it to know that you're right. Other comments and questions? We're about out of time. One more question? Okay, thank you very much.